Good morning, everyone. I am Jess Greenwood, and I want to thank you all for joining today's member webinar entitled One Concrete Step Towards Culturally Engaged Supervision. Just to go through a couple of housekeeping things first, we encourage questions to be asked throughout the presentation, but as a courtesy to our presenters, all attendees have been muted. If you have questions during the presentation, if you'll please utilize the Q&A box for your questions instead of the chat. That just allows us to use the chat to push information to you. We will be checking the chat just in case, but if you can prioritize using the Q&A box, that would be great. Questions will be read aloud during the last 5 to 10 minutes of the webinar. Today's learning objectives are define culturally engaged supervision and its importance in the supervision process. Examine communication as a fundamental strategy to facilitate culturally engaged supervision. And reflect on personal communication style and the impact on the supervision process. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Ian McFarlane and Krista Redlinger-Grossi. Ian received his PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Minnesota and currently serves as the Associate Director of Research and Director of Admissions for the University of Minnesota Genetic Counseling Training Program. He has been engaged with the field of genetic counseling for over 10 years, conducting research and providing training for supervisors. His primary research interests are professional development in counseling professions, clinical supervision, outcomes research, and research methodology. Krista Redlinger-Grossi received her master's in genetic counseling from the JHU-NIH Genetic Counseling Training Program and her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Minnesota. She is on faculty with the University of Minnesota Genetic Counseling Training Program as the Director of Fieldwork and Supervisory Training. She also has a private practice where she provides therapy support to individuals and families impacted by genetic information, risk, and diagnoses. We're very pleased to have both of you here today, and I will now pass it over to Krista.
Thank you so much, Jess. Welcome, everybody. Thank you also to NSGC for hosting this webinar. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank everybody for taking midday, early morning, wherever you're from, time with us together. So Ian and I are going to be presenting, as Jess introduced, one concrete step towards culturally engaged supervision. So thank you for joining. We feel really strongly this is an important topic, but we also recognize in the span of 1 hour, we are hoping to kind of take a sliver of this. So the work starts here, but we recognize that the work will continue on. I first want to just with the next slide, just do the obligatory. We don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I will say that our interest in this is feeling really that the importance of JEDI, JEDB work in our profession and specifically in supervision. So not a conflict, but certainly a huge bias that Ian and I hold. We also want to just begin, especially given Ian and I's institution here in Minnesota with a land acknowledgement. Certainly we are coming here from the Twin Cities, which is built in the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. So we certainly feel like it's important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, especially here at the University of Minnesota, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with the tribal nations. In acknowledging this, we certainly recognize that words are not enough, and that we must ensure that our institution here, as well as institutions elsewhere, provide support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And this certainly also goes to just increasing access to all, and I think that is really the crux of what today's discussion is going to be about. So with that acknowledgement, I just want to kind of go back and just introduce these objectives to you. But certainly we want to start by talking a bit about what is culturally engaged supervision, make sure that we're all on the same starting point, and talk about why we really feel this is important in supervision. Some of you have maybe heard Ian and I talk on this topic before. So if you are in that frequent flyer category, thank you for coming back. And I do think that this is always an important topic to review, as well as to continue to learn differently. in this discussion, we really wanted to offer today one sort of concrete step, specifically communication, as a strategy to facilitate culturally engaged supervision. And as I said at the start, I know that this is ongoing work. So we certainly, Ian and myself, want to acknowledge that this is just a sliver, but we hope to really leave you with something that's tangible so that you can continue to incorporate this into your supervision work as well as just your work in the field of genetic counseling. In examining communication as this fundamental strategy, Ian will lead us through inventory, a personal communication style inventory, and talk about the impact on the supervision process. So we're hoping to also have not just us here talking with you about this fundamental strategy, but also have you engage and do some personal reflection that you can then leave here with and incorporate into your supervision work. So that's what we're going to do in an hour, which seems like a whirlwind, but certainly hoping to take this first step here. To start, and I do believe we have the chat enabled. So take 30 seconds, 1 to 2 words. How would you describe culture? And then as you feel comfortable, please put this in the chat. 1 to 2 words to describe culture. If people feel comfortable and able. Tara, and if you maybe just even want to unmute yourself, I'm not able to see, or perhaps they're coming in the Q&A. I'm shifting webinar. Chat is disabled, chat is disabled. Thank you, Kate, Jenna. Maybe I can just read them here. Claudia, identify. Other things that you think of when you think about culture. And maybe this will just be a more internal exercise.
And you guys can certainly use the Q&A to answer this question as well. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thanks, Jess. Michelle, family tradition. Hi, Michelle. Just saw you last night. Jenna, self and community identity. Wonderful. How about others? I realized in asking this question and in previous workshops that Ian and I have done, this is a tough question. How do you distill culture into 1 to 2 words? Common shared practices within a community, population, and group, where you don't notice that you are different. Wonderful, Tara. And maybe where we notice that we're dissimilar, but also maybe some of those similarities come out. Claudia, sense of belonging. Enriched human experience, the essence of self. Wonderful. What I am seeing here, and I think what we were really hoping to kind of get us all grounded in the space, is to recognize how culture is very nuanced and maybe hard to describe and hard to distill into 1 or 2 words. And also, as we're seeing here in the Q&A, and hopefully as you are doing your own reflection, seeing and comparing what we're seeing here, very different for everyone. So thank you for this. Continue to think, and maybe even if you wrote this down, return to culture as I kind of walk us through these next slides in terms of what we're going to talk about today in terms of culture and then culturally engaged supervision. So here is a framework to think about culture, and this is the facets of culture. I think in the Q&A, I notice a lot of people are talking about their experience of culture and how they view culture. Let's talk about the facets of culture. Ian and I really ascribe to Pamela Hayes' addressing framework. As genetic counselors, you'll like that it's an acronym, like everything in genetics is. And really what it's doing is helping us pull out to think about how culture is in every sort of facet of our positionality, our intersecting identities. So addressing stands for age and generational influences. Certainly, I notice, especially in training, as I become more seasoned as a genetic counselor, the age and generational influences that give us different identities, developmental disabilities, and then also a nice nuance here, disabilities acquired later in life. So living with abilities and disabilities, but then acquiring a disability later in life is certainly going to differ in terms of the impact on identity. Religion and spiritual orientation, ethnic and racial identity, which I think is sometimes what we more commonly think of when we think of culture. So I also want to point out that I think that's a real important facet of culture, but again, we're pointing out some different factors. Socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, Indigenous heritage, as well as national origin and gender. So these, when we refer to culture, we are really taking a very holistic view of what culture is and how it forms and impacts our identities. I recognize that this isn't exhaustive. I had a student just the other day talked about military status. So there is very much different aspects of culture, but this is just to get us thinking a little bit about how culture is really everywhere, which means as part of our supervision work, we all bring many different aspects of this culture, which means that our supervision work is inherently multicultural. So when we talk about culturally engaged supervision, what does that mean? Ian, can you go to the next slide? We want to talk about culturally engaged supervision, meaning we are going to engage all these different facets of culture. And here I get on my soapbox again around the reciprocal engagement model, as well as the REMS, the reciprocal engagement model of supervision. And when I talk about my soapbox, the students are always like, you can always find a way to lace in the REM in all of your discussions, and that is true. So we know as part of our genetic counseling practice, we have the reciprocal engagement model of practice. And then we have later described, Colleen Worley and group described the reciprocal engagement model of supervision. So this picture that I'm asking Ian to put up here on the slide really depicts how the REM, our genetic counseling process, which is what we do with our patients and our clients in our genetic counseling work, our supervision model is going to really be a mirror, or what they call an isomorph, of this genetic counseling practice, which means we have here depicted on the right-hand side the 5 tenets of this supervision process, meaning learning, the tenet of learning and applying genetic information is key. And over here on the very right-hand side, the individual attributes of our students. And this is how we get into culture. Student autonomy must be supported. Students are capable and their emotions matter. And then the 5th tenet, which everything is really centralized around, which is the relationship, our relationship with our supervisees and our supervisees' relationship with us as supervisors. All of this factors into the genetic counseling supervision process. But we're going to return on the next slide to these top 3 tenets to talk a little bit about how culture impacts that. If I made that argument that all supervision, all genetic counseling is sort of multicultural, when we look at this tenet of student autonomy must be supported, we see here that we are, as supervisors, to integrate personal, professional, and cultural context into our relationship with our students and the decisions that we make in supervision. You'll see on the right here too, this also maps to some of the competencies that we know are important in genetic counseling supervision because of the work of Eubanks, Higgins, and group. So what I am trying to sort of lay out here is this idea that we as supervisors in sort of achieving our supervisory competencies are to explore our own cultural identity, and then how our identity affects our values and beliefs about counseling and supervision. We also are going to ask our students to do that. So today in this concrete step, we're going to start to talk a little bit about our own cultural identity and communication and how that comes and stems from our cultural identity. I also just want to talk a little bit about what we know in the literature about why this is important. Because we know based on the work here, these are just 2 examples, but we know that there's other work out there. Mike Seguitan looked at that REMS and looked at the goals and strategies. And one of the strategies that was identified was provide culturally competent supervision. We now use the term culturally engaged supervision, But what was interesting was Mike did focus groups of different supervisors and asked them to talk a little bit about the strategies they used to accomplish this. This was a bit back, 2018, but in his study, he found that supervisors really had a hard time articulating strategies as to how they achieve culturally competent supervision. This is a quote from one of the focus group members. Cultural differences between supervisors and students. I would ask the student to tell me more about their culture and how it may come into play in the clinic. If there are things they are opposed to doing, or if there are some issues that might come in session, I would hope that I would be upfront about it and just tackle it in the beginning before it came up. So supervisors are trying to work on how to begin to incorporate culture in supervision, but how that is done and how that is accomplished is a bit more difficult. Flash forward to the work of Nicola Carmichael and her focus group studies with racial and ethnic minority identifying students to talk about the fact that there is a lot of discomfort in clinical rotations as a result of cultural differences and the presence and prevalence of cultural insensitive statements and microaggressions experienced by these students. So we know that culture in supervision is certainly important by the competencies. How to do that is a little bit more difficult or hard to articulate. And then we know the impact on students is this discomfort and unfortunately racism and microaggressions. So we need some ways, some strategies, some concrete steps to be more culturally engaged in our communication with students. I'm not going to take time to read these in interest of time, but I think these are two studies, one by Cheyenne Dewey, who talked with supervisors about how they incorporate race and ethnicity into the supervision relationship. Supervisors in her study really talked about sort of the lack of this discussion and dialogue that is happening. And then Alvarado Wing and group in a study of sort of journey events of racial ethnic minority GC students talked again about their supervision experience and not feeling like they were able to discuss their obvious racial and ethnic differences and how that came up in the supervisory relationship, as well in their relationship with with clients and patients. So how to do this work? Communication is what Ian and I are trying to give us a starting point and entry point in being able to have these conversations.
Great. So I'm going to take over there and talk a little bit about communication as this tool. How can we use this in an intentional way to be setting the table to allow for some of these conversations? And how are we able then to work with communication and understand our own communication patterns as ways that can either enhance or hinder some of these exchanges? I think, you know, the quotes from the focus group about, I hope students will tell me, right? And we hope students will tell us, but also recognizing the power differentials and not only in terms of just the supervisor-supervisee relationship, but other power differentials based on social identities. As the person in the supervision relationship with more power due to the structure of your evaluatory role, it really is incumbent on us to invite and to do that cautiously and carefully, right? Not to pull identities out of students because that would be traumatic, but to create a space in which there's safety and there's a rationale for talking about these different things. So as we talk a little bit about this, I think Chris and I really want to emphasize the upfront work, the setting the table and setting expectations from day one. And so we really focus on this communication because it can be challenging to just outright ask somebody, you know, tell me about all your identities and the ways that this is going to impact our work, right? I don't know how I would answer that question, let alone, you know, someone who hasn't thought about this as much. And so we want to give you some pathways to get into these kinds of conversation. And we think one of the most straightforward straightforward kind of side paths into these conversations is around communications. It's something you're going to be talking about a lot with your supervisees, how they're communicating with patients and clients, how they're communicating with professional colleagues, how they communicate with you. And so we really want to emphasize that the expectation setting at the very outset can be a critical moment. And the more that we can set expectations and let students know how this is going to unfold, the better off we're going to be. So when we have clear expectations, it sets boundaries on our experiences. We know what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. Students in many research studies that we've done on supervision talk about one of the most anxiety and stress-provoking events is trying to figure out what supervisors want, right? How can I do this in the quote unquote right way, right? And so we know that gen ed counselors are a fairly type A and perfectionistic bunch. And so when there's murky expectations, it just spikes that stress, and it spikes that sense of something's going wrong. And in particular, a lot of that anxiety is around those evaluations, whether it's those informal evaluations you're giving every day or at mid-rotation, but especially those formal and summative evaluations at the end of a rotation. Okay. Again, when we can set clear expectations, we feel much more comfortable about our ability to perform. Just like if you think about your last annual review with your supervisor, right? Thinking about like, well, if they just say do better, right, then it's not really giving you a pathway. But the more specific we can be and the more we can set the boundaries ahead of time, the better we're going to be. When you set those expectations, you also create shared language that you and your supervisee can use. Talking about communication, talking about the different aspects that are included in communication, right? All of a sudden, there's something that can be named, as opposed to when we get in trouble, sometimes we talk vaguely about what we're asking from students. And that gets us into these sometimes also conversations where we rely on, again, really vague terms like professional communication. And we know, and many folks have been talking about the term professionalism and how steeped in white supremacy and patriarchy and just kind of normative and oppressive systems that the professionalism term really gets there. So the more specific we can be about communication and the more specific we can be in our language, right, the better we're going to be able to communicate accurately about this, right? And when we define terms like we did at the beginning of this talk, we know that we're talking about the same thing, right? As opposed to when I say one thing and a student might interpret it another way or vice versa. When we have these expectations, it also opens the door to regular check-ins on how we are or aren't meeting expectations. And I say we, meaning the student and the supervisor, right? So if we've set these things up ahead of time, as these are the expectations around communication, and we've set that as a bi-directional conversation, right? We can check in about how are we doing with ourselves, and we can ask our students. Now, again, it can be challenging for students to call us out or call us in and ask us to do better, right? But if we haven't set the table for that, and we haven't created this is what you can expect from us, right, then it's going to be even more challenging for those students. So how do we want to set those expectations? As early as possible. And you want them to be very explicit. Okay, there's again a lot of, just communicate professionally and we'll be fine. Or as long as we're both good communicators, right, that will be fine. Okay, but what does good communication actually look like? Okay, that varies quite a bit in different cultural groups, but also from clinic to clinic, from gen ed counseling training program to program. So the more explicit you can be, the better. I already mentioned that we really want to try to have expectations for both parties, and then thinking about inviting your supervisee to be able to, set some of those expectations for you, just as a way to level that power difference. Hey, either can be negotiable, right? But inviting them to create what would actually, be beneficial, which gets this next point about what helps them thrive, right? When I think about, being a supervisor or being an advisor, when I'm working with students, I really think about, or I think about, but I also ask them to tell me what's worked for you in relationships like this in the past. What kind of communication is helpful for you? How can I phrase things, or how can we time things in order for this to be most useful? I'm thinking about one of my advisees who, would talk with her supervisor and say, it's really important for me, even if it's only 30 seconds between patients, if I can just get a quick summary of that went well, here's something to work on for the next patient, right? Because otherwise she would get distracted and be thinking about her last patient while she moves into the next one. Okay, versus another one of my advisees who would say, like, I need to wait till the end of the day, right? I need to focus on prepping for that next patient. And then I need some time to kind of cool off and let some of my mind think through, how did I think that went? And it's hard for me to process that immediately after a session. So if we can talk about this at the end of the day, or even the beginning of the next day, that's going to be when I'm most receptive and I can have the most insight into what I think about how something went. Okay. Again, very important to hold yourself to whatever expectations you've set. Okay, you can say all kinds of nice things, but again, as the person with more power in the relationship, if you aren't holding yourself to those expectations, then there's no way we can really expect students to open up and be vulnerable with us. And so, I often take the task of kind of being really strict with my own expectations and communicating to students, oops, I didn't meet this deadline, or oops, I said we weren't going to do it this way and then I did, and naming that and articulating it so we can see, I'm open to criticism too. And so when we can see that we can be vulnerable and show our vulnerability as supervisors, then we are creating that sense of this is a place to be vulnerable. This is a place to discuss openly when we haven't met expectations or when we need to shift expectations. And we're able then to move into really kind of more productive spaces. Again, you got to show people that you're trustworthy and that you mean things before they will believe that it's true. We can tell them all we want, but until we show them, it's not really reasonable for that to be an expectation of ours. And then I always really recommend people to assess this regularly. It can be kind of an awkward conversation about, like, how are we communicating, right? And when I've done research, I ask people about how often do students and supervisors talk about this, and they both say, well, everything's going fine, so we don't talk about it, right? Or we'll talk about it if it goes bad, right? But that then creates this expectation that any kind of conversation about communication means there's a problem, right? And it doesn't give us time to explore, hey, this is working really well. What is it about this that is going well? Remember, so we can help our students to understand, what aspects of this do I need to carry forward? Oh, it is really helpful, this thing that you're doing as a supervisor. Oh, it's really helpful, this clinic policy. So we can put our own finger, and then as we learn and can evolve as supervisors, we can be thinking about how are we going to work with future supervisees. Not that what works with one is going to work with the next one, right? Especially around some of these things where we have to meet in the middle. But setting up kind of some regular check-ins, and I like to check in really frequently, probably weekly. And some of my advisees and students start to rolling their eyes about, okay, we're doing fine, I told you, right? But if I'm not asking and checking in, then it becomes, I'm not opening the door to those conversations. And again, as with more power, the door opening responsibility is on us. So I do see there's a question in the chat about using the term supervisee and student. I tend to use those fairly interchangeably. I guess I'm not making those particular distinctions. Again, most of us are working with students in this context of genetic counseling, although I'm sure many of you are also working with residents or other professionals, or if you are supervising new hires before they get certified for new graduates or things like that. So I suppose supervisee is a more inclusive term, although given our context today, because we're typically talking about students, I will probably slip back and forth between that language. I don't know, Krista, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, it's a great question, Tara. I also use them fairly interchangeably, although I do think, and I'm guessing the same for our audience here, we wear so many different hats. So at sometimes I am acting as professor, and so then typically we use the term student. And then with that exact same student, right, I'm sort of in this role of fieldwork director and talking about them in the role of supervision and sort of supervisee. So when on top of it, I can try to be a little bit more intentional about that use of terms to also help to clarify from what I am speaking about in terms of all those different multiple roles that we use. And I see Marguerite saying learner is the term used at my institution for the residents, fellows, and others. So I do think it's probably important, speaking back to culture, sort of what is the culturally accepted term, and sort of using those language and terms in an intentional way, so everybody is starting from the same place. Great point.
So how do we talk about communication? We're going to talk a little bit today, Krista and I, about communication styles. And I will put the caveat out there that neither Krista nor I are communication studies scholars. And so there is kind of rich literature on this in that field, if it's something you want to delve more deeply into. But kind of broadly, when we're talking about communication styles here today, we're talking about the patterns by which we prefer to communicate, kind of our natural habits that we use around communication. Most of us communicate differently in different contexts, right? We may talk in one fashion with our friends versus how we are going to talk in working in our professional life. I know my tone and my word choices change when I'm around my grandparents as compared when I'm around my my colleagues or friends, right? So we have different and varying degrees of flexibility around communication. Now, as genetic counselors, we're really taught to hone in on thinking about how we're communicating both really highly technical information and how we're communicating about psychosocial concepts to our clients and patients. So we have some use of flexibility and intentionality around that. And we can use those same skills and turn those into our supervision toolkit, right? Krista and I will probably reference the term parallel process a number of times as we move through this, where your supervision relationship and interactions will parallel things that are happening between students or supervisees and their interactions with patients and clients and other professionals. Okay? While we adapt, generally people adapt their communication styles to their surroundings, those default patterns often have roots in different cultural identities and shared traditional patterns, as well as life experiences along the way. So it's important as we're thinking about communication styles, there is some literature out there that suggests certain identities tend to have certain patterns, but it's important to know that those patterns are highly variable based on the degree of life experiences people have had or the types of life experiences they've had. If people have been shamed for speaking with an accent, if people have been shamed for certain word choices, then they're going to be much more careful around that. There's a lot of literature that people who come from some sort of marginalized background are often more adept and more thoughtful about code switching or adjusting some of those linguistic and communication patterns based on who they're around. And so those of us, certainly myself included, who come primarily from from backgrounds that are not oppressed, that are in the majority, I need to be thinking even more intentionally about my communication patterns and my flexibility, because I'm not often the one who is by the systems that I'm in expected to change those. And so if we want to be welcoming, we want to be inclusive and create a sense of belonging for supervisees, not just in our rotation, but in the field, right? We want to be showing them that we can adapt and mix cultural valued communication styles, and that we can be flexible enough to show them that this can work for them. They don't need to change fundamentally who they are or how they communicate to be in this setting, but how can we help them think through finding their authentic voice and finding who they're going to be as a genetic counselor, or resident, or other people that we help supervise. So in terms of communication style, there's a number of different things you can do to think about this. And so one is just to do some self-reflection. And so I'm going to give you an instrument in a minute to think a little more carefully about this, but I want you just to think about, how do you communicate? What are the kind of hallmarks of how you communicate? So for example, I know that I'm being really careful today because I'm on camera, but usually I'm a very kind of visual and talk with my hands kind of person, right? As well as I tend to tell a lot of stories, and I tend to teach and communicate with a lot of examples, rather than with kind of technical information. And so that can really help facilitate communication in some contexts. And with others, it's going to really bug them. They're going to be really annoyed with me that I'm talking about kind of indirectly in terms of these examples, or they're going to say, well, that's one occasion, right? How does that help me in a more general sense? So when I'm working with students, when I'm working with supervisees, I'm thinking about, okay, what's going to work for them and what's going to work for me, and how do we do this? So I'm probably not going to be able to eliminate my storytelling completely, but if this is something that there's not connecting with, how do I minimize that? And how do I remind myself and catch myself in the moment where, oh, I was going to tell you another story, but this is not going to work as well for you. So what you want is this kind of technical piece. Okay. And thinking about how do our typical patterns facilitate or impair this kind of cultural humility, where, to quickly define that term, where you don't make assumptions about culture, and you don't assume that just because it's the way you do it, that it's the right way, that you approach other people's backgrounds and personalities and cultural experiences with curiosity and inquisitiveness, rather than deficit kind of base. And how does it affect relationship building? So to kind of get at some of these points, and to think about some more dimensions of communication that might come to our head immediately, we have put together a communication self-reflection worksheet. And I am going to put the link to that in the chat. The link is also available on the slide that you see now. And it is a single, this is not a scientifically rigorous, we don't have validity data and things like that. This is not meant to diagnose or classify you as in a certain communication style. It is meant instead to start conversations, right? It's meant to think about, how do we tend to communicate? So I'm going to just pause for a moment and give you just a couple minutes to download this and to quickly go through it yourself. Try not to think too much about it. There's no right or wrong way or good place to be on these communication dimensions. So I will mute myself for about 2 minutes and give you a chance to look at it. Okay, you may not have had enough time to kind of fully work through that, and that's okay. Um, there was an excellent question from Sony in the chat about how do we convince people or convey to them that they don't need to code switch? And she points out that as someone who does code switch, she's not even sure she would believe a supervisor or someone who told her that, right? And I think that really speaks to the importance of, walking the walk, right? And how we can say a lot of things, and a lot of people say well-meaning things, but until we get to a point where we actually have demonstrated it, they aren't going to believe us, and they probably shouldn't. And so I'm blanking on the authors off the top of my head, but there's a great piece a couple years ago in New England Journal of Medicine about, I believe the title was something to the effect of trustworthiness before trust, right? And about how, as the person in power, you have the responsibility to demonstrate that you are trustworthy, that this is something that actually can happen before you have earned any trust from the folks you're working with. And so kind of to that point, when I think about like a concrete way that you might be able to communicate that is, naming code switching and showing an awareness of what that is, talking perhaps about, here are some ways that, you've observed previous students or supervisees code switching in the past, talking about this may be a place where you can do some role plays and say, this is something, let's talk about how you might want to break this down to a patient, or, we're going to talk to the pediatrician or the geneticist or something like that. How do you want to present it to them? And then we can talk together about kind of the ways to strategize around that, right? And ways to, how can I support you in that if you get pushback, right? And have thought through that. What are you willing, if you, a supervisor, are going to encourage a student to stick their neck out and do this without code switching, you better be prepared to have their back and advocate for them. If you leave them out to dry, then you're going to do a tremendous amount of damage. And hopefully, I want to come back to this perhaps in our Q&A time, but I want to talk a little bit more about this tool. Unless, Krista, if you wanted to jump in, I don't mean to monopolize the response.
No, I think let's definitely come back to it with this tool, because I'm hoping that this tool also helps to provide some entry points for dialogue that could then help to lead up to talking about code switching. For example, even on this first slide, internal versus external processor, right? Talking out loud about your code switching. And if you are scoring more in internal processing, it might be a reminder that you need to talk out loud and do some think aloud with a supervisee around, oh, I'm noticing myself doing the code switching that we talked about earlier in our rotation. So I think that this can provide maybe a safe starting point to then talk about, well, where does this come from and why, and then lead up to sort of disclosure as you feel comfortable around code switching. I want to get to the worksheet, but I also noticed we have a hand raising. Or Kathy, did you unraise your hand? We can come back to it too. So Kathy, raise it again if you want.
Okay, so in terms of using this tool, there's a couple of different ways that Krista and I have thought about using it. And please, if you think of more ways to use it, do it and let us know. Because we're developing this kind of toolkit, and this is just what we've thought of so far. So individually, kind of as we just did now, this can be a nice way to start thinking about self-awareness. Right, just raising, oh, I don't think about the fact that I am a high context communicator very often, or, this is what silence means to me when I'm silent, right? Oftentimes when I'm working with our students on this, we have our students do this exercise. They kind of really get into the, I haven't really thought about what silence means to me or what it communicates to others. But individually is one place to go, but I think really collaboratively is really important. So discussing this with the supervisor team where you work, right, and your colleagues. I think it's really interesting to have your colleagues fill it out about you, and as well as maybe your romantic partner or your family, people who know you really well and who know you in different contexts, so you can get a sense of some of the range of how you communicate, or at least how you're perceived by others. Again, as someone who identifies largely as an internal processor, right? In certain contexts, I'm very external, right? And when I'm in a mentoring relationship, I'm trying to narrate my thoughts so I can communicate how I'm thinking about and approaching a situation. So some of my advisees and supervisees would definitely label me an external processor. So thinking about how does that switch? And then also one of the ways we've really encouraged at our program and in other workshops we've done is fill this out for yourself and give it to the student, but then ask your student to fill it out for themselves and share it with you, right? And then you can start to find where are some points where we're going to align really well and where are some points where we might not, right? And that's how you can get into this transformative space, right? Where it's not just a here, I'll show you mine, you show me yours, and then we'll just know that this isn't going to work very well, or know that this is going to work great, right? Because just because we're both external processors doesn't mean that that's going to actually work, right? But when you use it in this transformational sense, you use it as a launching point, right? To create shared expectations, right? So, I see that we're not matched very well on this dimension, right? I tend to be very collaborative and you tend to be very hierarchical, okay? So, how can we work together and find a space in the middle, right? That's going to be something we both are going to be comfortable with, all right? Or how can I empower you to call me in when I'm being hierarchical, right? And so that, if I'm not creating space for you to do this, right? And I think, again, if we can ask students to do that, and then we have to respond really positively when we get called in, right? If we invite it, it's on us to be ready to be called in and to react in a non-defensive manner, right? I often go over the top thanking people the first few times they call me in, right? As I fell into that pattern, you're right, let's reset. Okay, and again, you don't have to make a huge deal out of it, just like, oh, yep, thank you for the reminder. And I think when you're owning that and showing them that you can make mistakes too, that can, in some ways, again, as a parallel process, be really empowering for them to see, oh, you can make a mistake and we can go get past it. Just like I can make a mistake with a patient or with a client, and it doesn't have to be the end of the world, right? And then when you start to have these conversations about how you're communicating, it's a much shorter jump to talk about, where did this communication pattern come from? Or, this is really typical for me in my family growing up or in my communities growing up. And, as someone who's from the Midwest, I can really talk about, we tend to be very indirect in communication, right? Some people talk about Minnesota nice, right? But really it's Minnesota passive aggressive, right? And so, when I'm working with students or supervisees from the East Coast, for example, who tend to be more direct in their communication, right? Some of the little subtle hints I'm dropping may not register, or they may get really frustrated with me and say, just say what you mean, right? And vice versa. That's just one geographic difference. So when we say like, oh, this really comes from, and we connect it to values, right? I tend to use silence because I value you having the time to think about your response, right? As an internal processor, I assume what you want is time to think about it before you tell me. I'm pausing, I'm not responding right away, not, because I really value being clear and precise with my words, and I need a minute to find the words that are going to capture what I'm trying to say, right? So when you can name those things, all of a sudden you erase some of those opportunities for misunderstanding. And you, again, create that space to how do we communicate together, as opposed to this is my communication style, get on board. Okay, again, that's one of those places you can start to minimize that power difference a little bit mean, there will always be a power difference, but the more we can chisel away at that, the more empowered our students will feel to be able to be open with us. Just like when we can empower patients, right, to ask us questions and empower patients to disagree with us. So as we think about starting to wrap up here, you know, what is the action plan, right? How do we take this and make it something you can integrate into your regular practice? So I would love it if you would just take 30 seconds or a minute here and write down 2 goals that you want to achieve when it comes to communication about culture with students. And then you may not have time to do this right now because I want to save some space for questions and answers. But once you come up with those goals, right, I want you to think about what's a communication expectation that you could set for yourself and for your supervisee that would facilitate you being more successful in that goal. Right. So if my goal is going to be create a space where students feel safe talking about their identities, a communication expectation might be that I would expect myself to share my identities first and to share the ways that they impact how I see the world. Right. And my expectation for a student would be that they could hear those and they could talk to me about places where that lines up really well for them or places where that might cause dissonance. Okay. I'm going to turn it over then to, I said I was going to give you a couple minutes. I lied because I'm looking at the clock, but I'm going to turn it over to Krista to do a little summary and lead us into the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So this is a whirlwind. This is a starting point, but we certainly hope that in today's time, and I think by virtue of you being here, maybe this first bullet point is moot, but culturally engaged supervision certainly starts with you. And so it starts here today and has been continuous prior to this, but hopefully will continue after. And I certainly hope that we've talked a bit about an entry point that provides opportunity as well as challenges, and wanting to not necessarily work from a deficit mindset, but really talk about and think about and convince you how culturally engaged supervision is actually going to enrich your work. This communication style worksheet, which we'll probably get back to in the Q&A, is hopefully a step for you to build some awareness around communication. Where does that then originate for you when you think of Pamela Hayes' addressing model? What are some of those different cultural factors that inform your communication? And what does that, where are some of those factors that inform communication for your student or your supervisee or your learner? And then, as I've talked about, this is ever evolving work. So we are not under the guise that today is a one and done situation, but rather with those goals that you set and sort of the action steps to move forward, how can you continue in this work? And hopefully this webinar has started in sort of one step on this journey. So we do have 5 minutes for questions, and I do see some additional questions in the chat box that I wanted to get to. Ian and I's contact information is here because this is ever evolving work for us. We would love to hear sort of reactions, if this tool has been helpful, if it hasn't been helpful. Again, we don't certainly pretend to sort of have it all or know it all in this domain at all. And so really welcome further conversation with everyone.
Thank you so much, Krista. We'll now open up for a few questions. I think we have about 5 minutes. But while folks are kind of getting their questions together, did you want to kind of go back to that first question there about addressing code switching with all of her students?
Yeah, great question. And I was actually thinking about that in relation to Sonia's question too. When you go through that workshop and worksheet and chime in, what I've noticed is I'm like, well, I'd fill this in differently if I was at home, or I'd fill this in differently if I was with friends versus colleagues. That is sort of in a nutshell, kind of that code switching where we're changing language, we're changing appearance based on different contextual pieces, whether it's where we are and who we are with. And for individuals from marginalized identities, we have seen, and the research is really showing about how much code switching goes on as a result of kind of living in a bicultural, multicultural different domains. So just to give you background on what code switching is. So I wonder about this worksheet pointing out those facets, and as an external processor, if you can talk about that out loud, and then if that comes up organically to the other question about bringing it up with all students, if that's then a way to enter into this conversation around code switching. I wonder what that means when you might be an external processor at home, but be a real internal processor here in your clinical rotation. How is that going to impact our work together as supervisee and student? Naming that might be an example of code switching. And then as students feel comfortable, right, or as you feel comfortable, begin to bring in some of those cultural identities that sort of impact and drive or motivate that code switching. So that's where I'm going to sort of say, I don't think it's necessarily something you talk about with everyone if it comes up organically. Also remember, this relationship is really key. So as trust is being built and baked in your supervisee student relationship, I think that then maybe more discussion around code switching, or also maybe other topics that might feel more comfortable when that trust is established.
Thanks, Krista. We'll move on to the next question. Sorry.
I would recommend addressing code switching with everybody. And I would, one, because you don't know what invisible minorities or identities may be present, but also I do couch it in terms of, I talk about, like, we talk differently with our friends and our colleagues and our professional colleagues, but I say the degree to which we code switch is often related to, our identities and the extent to which our identities are represented and appreciated and you can feel belonging in different settings. And so I think I couch it there to kind of communicate that I know what code switching is, and two, I get that it's not the same for everybody. But it is something we all do, right? And so I think that helps open the door and often communicates that I understand there's some nuance to it, which I think often helps that conversation along.
Great, and maybe we can just end with this question, which is, how can training programs aid in this? Can you expand on if or how you both provide guidance to your supervisors about these practices, as well as guidance to your students about approaching communication with their supervisors?
Yeah, we have students do all of our students do this worksheet, and we talk about it in class. So all of our students are ready for this. We encourage them to send it out to all of our supervisors when they're doing their introductions to their new supervisors. And we've done multiple workshops with our supervisors to train them on using this tool. So it is kind of an expectation at this point. We don't mandate it, but we've had really good results, I think, on both the student and supervisor side. Krista, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think longitudinally, just really reinforcing and continuing to come back. I know certainly with my advisees too, continuing referencing. And so with our supervisors, we're really providing a lot of training and support around continuing to return back to this. Even when they reach it back to me, hey, I'm having some struggles with this student around XYZ. What do you think is going on here in regards to the communication? And then referencing back to this communication style worksheet. I know we didn't have time for all the questions, but please, with our contact information, there's such amazing questions. Tara, Tyler, if you don't mind reaching out, certainly to Ian and myself, we'd be happy to kind of do an offline conversation if we can't do that today.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. This concludes today's member webinar. And so on behalf of the NSGC webinar subcommittee, I want to thank you all for attending, and also a huge thank you to our speakers. I do want to make it noted that the webinar recording will be posted to the webinar page of the NSGC website within 48 hours. So thank you all again and have a wonderful day.